50 years ago this month, one of the most iconic liberals in American history was in the throes of a full-blown crisis with his president. Senator Robert F. Kennedy and President Lyndon Johnson's already torturous relationship was getting even worse as the two publicly began to disagree on the merits of the Vietnam War. That split would eventually propel RFK into seeking the Democratic presidential nomination, culminating, of course, tragically with his assassination in June 1968. Larry Tye has written a remarkable new book with new insights called Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon. And he joins us now on the line from Boston, Massachusetts. Larry, good of you to join us tonight. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I'm glad to be with you.
Well, I must say I love the book very much, but I also wondered before cracking the cover, with so many books about Bobby Kennedy having been written, what made you think, even off the top, that you had something new to say about him?
So it was partly that I think that there's lots of new material that was being released by the Kennedy Library and others. It's partly that lots of people who were around in Bobby Kennedy's era aren't going to be around much longer. I interviewed in the course of the book between 400 and 450 people, and sadly, just in the time that I was writing the book, a third of them died. And it's partly that I had what I thought was a different take on who he started out as and who he became. And when a major publisher says you can do it and you're as interested in the guy as I was in Bobby Kennedy, you do it and you try to prove that you've got something new and interesting.
Well, you had a personal connection to him. What was it?
So it was several personal connections. Partly it was that I went to high school with his middle and most tragic child, David Kennedy, who died of a drug overdose. It was partly that I'd covered, as a longtime reporter at the Boston Globe, the Kennedy family, and especially Bobby's younger brother, Ted. And it was also that I live most of my time on Cape Cod, about 15 minutes from the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. So I was infused with Kennedy stuff all my life, and the chance to write a book about somebody who I grew up with as a hero was an opportunity that I couldn't pass up.
Well, and you were demonstrating some of that connection on your lapel. Where'd you get that button?
So I got that button at a wonderful talk. I've done about 100 Bobby Kennedy talks across North America, and at one in San Francisco at something called the RFK Democratic Club, I appeared with an old Vietnam-era guy named Daniel Ellsberg, and they handed out to everybody who came that night these wonderful Bobby Kennedy buttons.
Daniel Ellsberg is certainly well known to us. Pentagon Papers, a whistleblower, maybe the original whistleblower, if you like. Let's start with this here, because the book does break new ground, and certainly this was new to me when I learned that RFK had a close friendship with the most red-baiting conservative senator, maybe of all time, Joe McCarthy. Bobby Kennedy, you tell us, even snuck into his funeral and asked the journalist not to report that he was there. How do we explain this friendship?
So we explained it partly because Bobby had just graduated from the University of Virginia Law School. He was solidly in the middle of his class, and he was out looking for a job. And Papa Joe, Joe Kennedy, said to Bobby, "I've given enough money to Joe McCarthy that hopefully he will hire you." And Kennedy makes a call to McCarthy. McCarthy says, "Sure, I'll hire your son. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with him." So that was part of the reason that whenever Bobby's dad said do something, Bobby generally did it in those days. But it was also that Bobby was a convinced Cold Warrior, and he thought that the only one back in those days who was taking seriously the threat of the Soviet Union, not just on a world stage, but behind every pillar in the U.S. State Department, the only guy who was taking seriously that internal threat in America was Joe McCarthy. So Bobby Kennedy went to work for him enthusiastically, and while many of Bobby's defenders would have us believe that that 7.5 months was just a footnote or an asterisk in Bobby's career, it in fact was something that Bobby truly believed in, and for the rest of his life, Bobby Kennedy defended Joe McCarthy.
Let me ask you about, in spite of the fact that Bobby Kennedy was an extremely famous man, he was actually only the second most famous Kennedy brother in that family, of course. His brother John, 8 years his senior, became president. How close was their relationship?
The relationship was close enough that 50 years later, when Bobby's widow Ethel was describing it to me, she said it wasn't just that they finished one another's sentences, it was that they didn't even have to verbally articulate what they were thinking, that they understood one another well enough that they knew what each other was thinking without having to go verbal with it.
After JFK won the presidency, he of course famously appointed Bobby as his Attorney General, despite the fact that Bobby was only 35 years old. How did they at the time justify that?
So they justified it by JFK joking about it. He said that Bobby, who had never tried a case in a court of law, he said, "I'm trying to give my little brother Bobby some legal experience, and this was an opening that I had." The truth was that Joe Kennedy had made clear to Jack that he could have freedom and not have to listen to his dad in just about every appointment that he made except for one, and that one was what would happen to Bobby. And Joe Kennedy rightfully said to Jack, "Bobby helped elect you as president. He was your campaign manager. He was your alter ego. And I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, you've got to make him Attorney General." Now, it didn't hurt the fact that Joe Kennedy, who was always looking over his shoulder, who was always skirting the law and looking over his shoulder and wondering whether the government might go after him for anything from his bootlegging to his stock manipulations, it wasn't a bad idea if you were worried about your own legal situation to have your son be the U.S. Attorney General.
Indeed. Well, mobsters at the time were not so lucky because certainly Bobby went after them with a great deal of zeal, unions as well, even those with Democratic Party connections. What did JFK think about RFKs going after them?
So JFK wondered whether Bobby would have any grasp over the job of Attorney General. Bobby started out with arguably one of the worst resumes that any young Attorney General, any Attorney General of any kind has ever had. And I would argue that Bobby went on to become what was the most effective Attorney General in the modern era and maybe any time. And that was reflected, as you say, in the fact that he staged the most aggressive campaign ever against organized crime. He went after corruption in the Teamsters and other unions. He went after civil rights violators, and he was there whether you were a Democrat or a Republican. If you broke the law, Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department was out there wanting to take a look at you.
What impact did the president's affairs have on his younger brother?
So I think that Bobby Kennedy tried during his entire time running his brother Jack's campaigns and being his Attorney General to be a little bit of a policeman in terms of just how blatant he would be in carrying on affairs. And I think he was very worried that this could damage, if not ruin, Jack's presidency. If he wasn't worried about it, J. Edgar Hoover, who kept all the files on all of this stuff, was perpetually letting him know that he had damaging information on the Kennedys. And I think it was something that Bobby was perpetually aware of and trying to do things to tone his brother down.
We are almost 55 years exactly away from the color barrier being broken at Ole Miss University. James Meredith being the first student to get in there. What role did Bobby Kennedy play in making that happen?
So Bobby Kennedy played an essential role in making that happen. He had learned from riots in Birmingham, Alabama, in Montgomery, Alabama, that civil rights leaders were rightfully going to press their case whether or not the government was on their side. He had learned from Governor George Wallace in Alabama just how resistant, and from his predecessor, Governor Patterson in Alabama, how resistant Southern governors could be. So when he went up against the governor of Mississippi, who was trying to keep Meredith and other blacks out of Ole Miss, Bobby Kennedy was seasoned, he was effective, he brought in federal troops when they were needed, he got James Meredith registered, and more importantly, he made a statement that the Kennedy administration was not going to listen to obstructionists, and it was going to enforce the laws, it was going to enforce court decisions. And while he started out clueless on civil rights, Bobby Kennedy made the kind of impact that Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders hoped he would make.
So Dr. King came to appreciate Bobby Kennedy?
So Martin Luther King, in the early days when Bobby was in his clueless phase, Martin Luther King said to his young proteges, there is deep within this Attorney General Bobby Kennedy good, and it is up to us to pull that good out of him. By the end, Martin Luther King was convinced that it had worked, that he had been right, and that Bobby Kennedy was the most effective Attorney General on civil rights issues that America had ever seen.
Now, again, on civil rights, it's interesting you say that he became actually a great champion for black-white civil rights and improving those relationships. But I also learned in your book he wasn't what you'd call particularly gay positive. How come?
Because if you were a Bobby Kennedy fan, you would say because the issue hadn't quite caught up with him, that Bobby Kennedy was generally ahead of the curve on most issues, but that curve was so far ahead in terms of gay rights. And I also think in the Kennedy family, they had this whole macho sense about everything from what masculinity was to what sexuality was. And I think that they were never especially enlightened, and certainly Papa Joe wasn't, on the issues of gay rights. And Bobby Kennedy, I think, was a chip off his father's block, at least in those days, when it came to gay rights.
Larry, I want to take you to November 22nd, 1963, and I want you to tell us how RFK got the news that his brother had been assassinated in Dallas.
So Bobby Kennedy spent that day the way he did most days as Attorney General, which meant that he worked really hard in the morning at his office, and then at about lunchtime, in a way that only the rich and powerful could do, he had his large, chauffeur-driven limousine pull up to the Justice Department and take him and a lucky young aide out to the Kennedy estate in Hickory Hill, which was in Virginia, just outside of Washington. Bobby got into, it was a relatively cold day in November, but Bobby Kennedy got into his bathing suit, took a relaxing swim, was just drying out when he got out of the pool, having his tuna fish sandwich for lunch, when the phone rang. And the phone at poolside in the Bobby Kennedy mansion was not a normal telephone, it was a hotline to the White House. Ethel picks up the phone, holds it up, and says to Bobby, "It is J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, on the phone." And Bobby's heart started to sink before he even got to the phone, because he knew Hoover never called with good news. In a monotone that Bobby would say later was like Hoover delivering the weather report, J. Edgar Hoover said one thing to him. He said, "Your brother has been shot in Dallas." An hour later, a second phone call comes in and it says, "Your brother is dead." Bobby Kennedy did something extraordinary at that point. He rallied in a way that was the way that Joe Kennedy knew that he would rally when he dubbed Bobby the new leader of the Kennedy clan. He called brother Ted and he said, "You will call and tell our parents what had happened." He called sister Eunice Kennedy Shriver and he said, "You and your husband, Sergeant Shriver, will start planning the funeral." He became the nation's mourner-in-chief. Anytime television showed Jackie Kennedy, the widow, for the next month, it was always Bobby by her side and by John and Carolyn Kennedy's side. He was extraordinary. He had lost his brother, his boss, and his best friend, and yet for a month he rallied in a way that helped the country pull it together. But at the end of that month, when the Kennedy family was starting to pull it back together, when the country was starting to rally, Bobby Kennedy crashed. And Ethel Kennedy, half a century later, says that Bobby went into a serious clinical depression that lasted for several months.
At what point do people start coming to him saying, "You need to pick up the torch and run for the presidency yourself"?
So in August of 1964, Bobby Kennedy decides that instead of sort of giving it all up and going off and teaching or traveling around the world, that he's going to run for senator from New York. And he enters the campaign in October of that year, 1964. It dawns on Bobby that he could actually lose this campaign unless he really pulls it together. That's the moment when he started pulling out of his depression. That's the moment when he started running a great campaign. He wins as senator from New York, and starting that January, when he starts serving as senator, people are begging him to consider running for president, to take on the president on everything from anti-poverty issues to the war in Vietnam. And almost from day one of his Senate tenure, the country starts dreaming of another Kennedy in the White House.
Well, there's no reason why people would remember this because it's more than 50 years ago, but he and Ted were actually both in the Senate at the same time, I think you tell us, for about 4 years together. Any rivalry there, or how'd that all work out?
So it was an extraordinary thing. When Bobby decided an issue was his, Ted would give him free rein, and that was like taking on the president on Vietnam. When Ted decided an issue was his, like issues of kids that Ted was passionate about, Bobby gave him free rein. There was friendly rivalry, but there was a bond. When Bobby and Jack were in government together, they had the closest thing that America has ever seen to a co-presidency. And when Ted and Bobby served together in the Senate, they had the closest thing that America's ever seen to a shared Senate tenure. And I think Ted Kennedy ended up spending his 50 years in the Senate trying to be Bobby.
Well, did he succeed, given that he became one of the great lions of the Senate?
He did indeed. He knew that his big brother Jack had been a mediocre senator. He knew that in 4 years, Bobby Kennedy had accomplished more than just about any senator has ever done in such a short tenure. And I think Ted knew that all the issues that he became impassioned about, everything from being anti-war in Vietnam and Iraq to caring about civil rights, to caring about fighting poverty, he knew those were the issues that Bobby would have made the cornerstone of his tenure as a senator, and if he ever made it to the White House, in the White House as well.
Let me take you to 1968. As we suggested in the intro, his relationship with Lyndon Johnson, the president, is deteriorating, mostly over Vietnam. Johnson announces he's not going to seek re-election. It does open up the field significantly. And then there is the shocking assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and American inner cities everywhere explode in outrage, but not in Indianapolis. What happened in Indianapolis?
So something magical happened in Indianapolis. Bobby Kennedy is campaigning in his first contested primary in Indiana, and the day that Martin Luther King is killed, Bobby flies in on the family plane called the Caroline to Indianapolis, and he's greeted at the airport by the young mayor named Richard Lugar, who went on to become an old and powerful U.S. senator. Lugar says to Bobby, Martin Luther King has been shot and killed today in Memphis. Bobby is devastated. Lugar, the mayor, goes on to say, you have planned tonight a rally in the middle of the black ghetto of Indianapolis, but I'm telling you, you can't go there. You can't go there because if you go in there, you might not come out alive, and if you go there, there might be a riot. Bobby says thanks for the advice, and he proceeds to drive into the middle of the black ghetto to the rally he had planned to give in Indianapolis. He starts out his speech by saying to the crowd, most of which doesn't know that Martin Luther King has been shot, he says, Martin Luther King has been shot tonight, and this is really horrible news. And you can hear in that crowd, 99% black, several hundred people, you can hear shrieks and people saying, oh no, it can't be true. For the next 5 minutes, Bobby Kennedy has tossed away the notes that his aides have prepared for him, and for the next 5 minutes he gives what might be the most eloquent and impassioned speech a white politician has ever delivered to a black audience in the history of America. He talks most importantly about the fact that 5 years before he lost his brother. It is the first time in public in those 5 years that Bobby Kennedy has ever talked about the death of Jack Kennedy. And he can't bring himself to say the words Jack or my brother. All he can tell the audience is, I lost a member of my family, and I know how you feel tonight. Bobby Kennedy went into that ghetto to embrace the black community on the loss of Martin Luther King, and people were so moved by what he said that the community instead embraced him on the loss of his brother. That night, the night of Martin Luther King's death, there were riots in more than 100 cities across America. In Washington, D.C., a big part of the city was burned down that night. One of the only cities with a black population that didn't riot that night was Indianapolis, Indiana, and the reason was Robert Francis Kennedy.
June 5th, 1968, the other tragic assassination that year. RFK is himself gunned down while campaigning. It's at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. And if I read your book correctly, you seem to suggest that he had a notion that the campaign was going to end that way. Is that right?
So Bobby understood, he was smart enough to know that he had lost an older sister and an older brother, Kathleen and Joe Jr. He had lost to an assassin's bullet his big brother and best friend, Jack Kennedy. And Bobby spent the entire campaign being philosophical and almost accepting the fate that his life was likely going to end the same way. He had exactly one security guy. It was an ex-FBI agent, the only guy to carry a gun. That agent that night in Los Angeles, the night of Bobby Kennedy's big win in the California primary, that agent for the first time in the campaign wasn't by Bobby's side. He was actually helping a pregnant Ethel Kennedy get off the podium where Bobby had been speaking. Bobby is taking a shortcut to his press conference by going through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel. He is shot at close range by an assassin named Sirhan, and in his dying moments, he was, instead of worrying about what was going on with him, he was asking Ethel and everybody who was crowding to his side, was everybody else all right, and was anybody else hurt? And it was like he did know what was going to happen. He knew that his life was probably not going to be as long as he wanted it to be, and he was, I thought, heroic down to his last breaths that night.
Larry, in our remaining moments, I want to ask what I think are the two most interesting words when considering history, and those words are, what if? So let's say he wins the Democratic presidential nomination. He's therefore going up against Richard Nixon in the 1968 election. What do you think would have happened?
So I think very definitely what would have happened. I think the ticket would have been, the Democratic ticket would have been that year, Bobby Kennedy as president, and running as his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, the sitting vice president with Lyndon Johnson. I think that if it was anybody in America in 1968 who understood Richard Nixon's vulnerabilities, it was the guy who had run his brother's campaign against Nixon and beat him 8 years before. Bobby Kennedy was dying to take on Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon felt more threatened by Bobby Kennedy than any of the potential Democrats. There would not have been riots in Chicago at the Democratic Convention had Bobby Kennedy been the nominee. He was on the cusp of pulling together a coalition that I think would have been unique in American history, combining, in today's terms, angry white Donald Trump voters who were with Bobby from his early Joe McCarthy conservative days, with Hillary Clinton's coalition of liberals and minorities. And I think what would have happened is Bobby Kennedy would have won, and he was an impatient enough guy that in the first 15 minutes in the White House, he would have tried to do the things that his brother Jack was too cautious about doing in terms of getting us out of Vietnam, proposing and passing a tough civil rights bill, going after poverty. I think he could have been one of the great liberal, iconic presidents in American history.
And of course, there would have been no Watergate, would there?
There would have been no Watergate, and there might not have been 50 years later a Donald Trump.
Really, you want to draw a straight line between those two events?
I want to draw a straight line partly because Donald Trump was as much playing from the Joe McCarthy playbook, and Bobby Kennedy understood that playbook better than anybody. And I'm working today on a biography of Joe McCarthy, and I see extraordinary parallels, and I think Bobby Kennedy would have seen those as well.
The well-known journalist Elizabeth Drew said that Bobby Kennedy was a flame that the moths couldn't resist. What did she mean by that?
So I think that she was talking about herself and journalists, and this guy was so impassioned that journalists were drawn to him because they had never seen a politician that authentic, a politician who told people the hard truths that they didn't want to hear, a politician that went into white communities and black communities at a time of racial division that rivals what we see in America today, and he told black audiences and white audiences the same difficult message, that we need safe streets and that the only way we get safe streets is by having racial justice.
I think American liberalism has been looking for the next Bobby Kennedy ever since he was killed in 1968. Who, in your view, do you think has come the closest to fulfilling that part?
So I would like to be able to tell you that his son, Bobby's son Christopher, who is running for governor of Illinois today, Christopher seems to me to have his father's intelligence, his passion, and his sense of how to pull together America. And what I'd like to be able to tell you, and I don't know if it's going to happen, that the iconic liberal of today's world might be a guy named Kennedy.
Now that's interesting, because I thought for sure you were going to say Barack Obama, which I guess is the obvious conventional wisdom answer. How come you did not say that?
So I loved Barack Obama's presidency, but what Barack Obama lacked that Bobby Kennedy had was not just being a really smart and committed and passionate liberal, but he lacked the toughness that Bobby had. That old Joe McCarthy toughness, combined with all the things that Barack Obama did have, might have given us some blend between Lyndon Johnson and Barack Obama, and that's what I think Bobby Kennedy was.
After writing more than 500 pages about him, aren't you just desperate to meet him? Like, aren't you just so sad you never got a chance to meet him?
I am, but I think talking to his widow, talking to his kids, and talking to everybody who was alive who was important in his life made me feel a little bit like I did meet Bobby Kennedy.
It's a great book, Larry. Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon by Larry Tye, and we're so grateful you spared so much time for us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.